Picture a merchant in ancient Egypt, around 650 BCE. He wants to buy cedar wood from a Phoenician trader. First, he weighs out a pile of silver. Then the Phoenician tests it, scrapes it, bites it, argues about the purity. They bring in a third party with a balance scale. An hour later, they're still negotiating whether the metal is good enough. Now picture a merchant a few decades later. Across the Aegean Sea, he reaches into a pouch, pulls out a small stamped disc of metal, and hands it over. Done. That disc changed everything. Welcome back to the history of economic thought. Last episode, we saw how ancient Egypt ran a sophisticated economy for 3,000 years without coins. Grain was money. The pharaoh's granaries were the banks. It worked brilliantly for a centralized state that controlled the Nile. But the world beyond the Nile was messier, more fragmented, more competitive. And in that world, someone was about to invent the most important economic technology since writing itself. The Kingdom of Lydia sat in what is now Western Turkey, wedged between the Greek colonies on the coast and the vast empires of the east. And Lydia had a peculiar advantage. Its rivers, especially the Pactolus, carried electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, washed down from the mountains. Around 600 BCE, under King Alyattes or possibly his son Croesus, the Lydians did something no one had done before. They took lumps of this electrum, stamped them with the image of a roaring lion's head, and declared them to be money, not just metal, not just bullion you had to weigh and test, official, state-guaranteed, standardized coins. Think about what that lion stamp meant. It was a promise. The king of Lydia guarantees this piece of metal weighs exactly what it should and contains exactly the purity it claims. You don't need to test it. You don't need to weigh it. You just need to trust the stamp. In one stroke, the Lydians solved the fundamental problem that had plagued metal-based trade for centuries. The trust problem. Every transaction before coins required verification. Every transaction after coins required only recognition. Croesus, who took the throne around 560 BCE, pushed the innovation further. He separated gold and silver into distinct coin denominations, creating the world's first bimetallic currency system. Gold coins for large transactions, silver coins for everyday trade. His wealth became so legendary that 2,500 years later, we still say someone as rich as Croesus. The man's name literally became a synonym for wealth, and it's not hard to see why. He didn't just have money. He had invented a better kind of money. The idea spread like fire. Greek city-states, those fiercely independent, perpetually competitive polities, scattered across the Aegean, adopted coinage within decades. And because Greeks were Greeks, every city minted their own. Corinth had its winged horse, Aegina had its sea turtle, and Athens had its owl. The Athenian silver tetradrach, stamped with the owl of Athena on one side and the goddess herself on the other, became arguably the most important coin in ancient history. Here's why. Athens controlled the silver mines at Laurion in southern Attica, and they maintained fanatical consistency in their coin's silver content. Merchants from Spain to Afghanistan knew that an Athenian owl contained exactly the silver it promised. It became the world's first international reserve currency, the ancient equivalent of the US dollar. Not because anyone forced people to use it, but because everyone trusted it. Those Laurion silver mines didn't just make Athens rich. They saved Western civilization. In 483 BCE, a massive new vein of silver was discovered at Laurion. The Athenian statesman Themistocles convinced the assembly to spend the windfall on building 200 warships instead of distributing it to citizens. 3 years later, that fleet destroyed the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis. The silver in the ground became ships on the water, became the survival of Greek independence. Economic resources directly determined military outcomes. They always do. But coinage didn't just change trade and warfare. It changed the very structure of political power. Here's the mechanism, and it's subtle. A state mints coins. Then the state demands that taxes be paid in those coins. Now every citizen needs to acquire coins. The only way to acquire coins is to sell goods or labor in the marketplace. Suddenly, everyone is participating in the market economy, not by choice, but by necessity. The state creates the money, demands the money back as tax, and in between, an entire commercial economy springs to life. Economists call this the chartalist theory of money. Money doesn't emerge naturally from barter. The state creates it, and the tax system gives it value. Coinage also made possible something that transformed the ancient world: mercenary armies. Before coins, how did you pay a soldier? You gave him land. You gave him rations. You gave him a share of the plunder. All of these tied soldiers to specific places and specific campaigns. But coins were portable, universal, and anonymous. You could hire a warrior from Crete, a slinger from Rhodes, a cavalryman from Thessaly, pay them all in silver, and let them buy whatever they needed wherever they were. Armies became purchasable. Military power became a function of treasury size. The implications were enormous. Not everyone welcomed this new money economy. In Sparta, the reaction was deliberate and extreme. The Spartans, those famously austere warriors, used iron bars called obors as their currency. Not because they couldn't get silver, because they didn't want it. Iron bars were heavy, bulky, and practically worthless outside Sparta. That was the point. You couldn't accumulate portable wealth. You couldn't secretly get rich. Foreign merchants had no reason to set up shop in a city where the money weighed more than the goods. Sparta's iron currency wasn't primitive. It was a policy choice, an anti-commercial monetary strategy designed to prevent the wealth inequality and luxury that the Spartans believed had corrupted every other Greek city. Meanwhile, Athens was grappling with the opposite problem: too much commerce, too much debt, too many citizens losing their land and their freedom to creditors. Around 594 BCE, the Athenians appointed Solon as archon and gave him extraordinary powers to fix the crisis. What he did was remarkable. He cancelled existing debts, a reform called the Caesarchia, literally the shaking off of burdens. He freed citizens who had been enslaved for debt. He reformed the currency, adjusting weights and measures to ease the burden on debtors. And he restructured Athens' political classes based on agricultural output rather than birth. This was one of history's first comprehensive economic reform programs. Not just a debt jubilee, but a systematic reorganization of who owed what, who owned what, and who had power. The contrast between Athens and Sparta reveals something fundamental. Both were Greek. Both had coins, or at least money. But they made radically different choices about what role money would play in their societies. Athens embraced commerce and became a wealthy, innovative, culturally explosive democracy. Sparta rejected it and became a disciplined, stable, militarily fearsome oligarchy. Two monetary philosophies. Two completely different civilizations. The technology was the same. The politics were opposite. The final chapter of this story belongs to Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s and 320s BCE, he didn't just spread Greek culture and language, he spread Greek money. Across his vast empire, from Egypt to the borders of India, Alexander imposed a unified coinage based on the Attic weight standard. For the first time in history, a single monetary system connected the Mediterranean to Central Asia. A merchant in Alexandria could pay with the same coins accepted in Babylon, in Persepolis, in Taxila. It was the ancient world's first large-scale monetary zone, and it supercharged trade across 3 continents. Step back and consider what happened in just 2 centuries. Around 600 BCE, a king in western Turkey stamped a lion on a lump of electrum. By 300 BE, standardized coinage had restructured trade across the known world, funded the navies that decided the fate of civilizations, enabled the hiring of armies across borders, forced populations into market economies through taxation, sparked the first great debates about wealth and equality, and unified an empire stretching from the Nile to the Indus. A small stamped disc of metal. That's all it was. And it changed everything. But the Greeks didn't just mint coins and fight wars. They also started doing something no civilization had done before. They began thinking systematically about how economies work. Why do prices change? How should a household manage its resources? Can a state increase its wealth through deliberate policy? Next time on the History of Economic Thought, we meet the man who literally invented the word economics. His name was Xenophon, and almost nobody today has heard of him. That's about to change.